to Paris. And my question is, could Canada find its feet by 2030? I'm going to offer some reflections, lessons, and questions. My background for doing this is that I've been involved with the issue of global warming since 1987, and with computer modeling of energy systems for even longer than that. I'm starting with a cartoon by Cameron Cardwell, who was the staff artist for the Ottawa Citizen. On the right-hand side here, we have a group of Girl Guides and Boy Scouts who are about to put out their fire to help to save the planet. And on the other side, we've got this big, big factory doing all kinds of stuff. This picture for me captures something that's been going on ever since Kyoto, which was 1997. Government of Canada and most other governments have been fiddling on the margins, trying to turn off the campfire to save the planet. And it also makes the point that global warming is indeed a global issue. Everybody's engaged, and if we're going to deal with it, primarily the 20 richest countries in the world are those who are going to do it. This is a picture 5 years after the signing of the protocol in Kyoto, of the House of Commons, the government side of the House of Commons. The House of Commons had just ratified the Kyoto Protocol, which means we were now officially on board. They're happy, but when I look at this picture, I see more than just being happy about passing an important piece of legislation where Canada will perhaps play its part on the global scene. When I look at the face of Mr. Chrétien or Damboudria, the second from the right, he was the member from Prescott Russell, even John Manley, a gentleman politician, if there ever was one, I see people more than just proud of passing this piece of legislation. I see people mocking their adversaries on the other side of the house. When I saw that over Christmas in 2002, I wrote a letter to Maurice Bélanger, who at the time was the Member of Parliament for Vanier, not my MP. But I knew Maurice because he'd been right-hand man to Jean-Luc Pepin, who had been my MP, and I also knew his spouse better. She and I were both founding members of the Gloucester Arts Council, a municipal committee that spent $1 per head on arts in Gloucester on behalf of that population. And my point to him was that if you and I are to smile on this issue in 2008, 2012, that's the commitment period for the Kyoto problem. There's a very large task ahead, much bigger than most of us realize. And my blunt message is simply that the government Canada is a full decade late in effectively addressing climate change. And I had to advise him that I am no longer as proud to represent Canada in international meetings as I used to be. I was, for many years, a Canadian delegate to meetings at the OECD and the International Energy Agency. By this time, I was now Executive Director of the Energy Council of Canada, representing that council in international meetings of the World Energy Council. I was present when John Fraser, he was MP, he had been MP for a riding in British Columbia, and at this stage he was Canadian ambassador for the environment. He briefed the Energy Council, and one of the things he said was, this is just February 1998, 2 months after the Kyoto Protocol had been signed. We had stumbled from Rio to Kyoto. Rio is where the government of Canada joined the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and I'll come back to that. My contention is that the government of Canada has continued to stumble and still is. We live in a very large country, but it's also a pretty complicated one. The British North America Act in 1867 deliberately identified specific roles for the federal government and for the provincial government, recognizing that the situations in the provinces were not identical and that the provinces needed to be able to look after issues like health. Mr. Chrétien, in another cartoon, I like cartoons. Once again, I have been misquoted by the media. I said ratifie, not compli. But poor Mr. Chrétien couldn't possibly have understood what it would take to comply with the agreement that his government had pushed through the House of Commons. He did not know himself, and he was not briefed with the kind of insights that were available at that time that came from computer analysis of energy systems. Let me just show you what Canada said it was going to do over a number of occasions. The first one was a special ad hoc conference hosted by the Government of Canada in Toronto. There were about 500 delegates from 50 or 60 countries, a mixture of scientific people and political people. They spent 2 or 3 days thinking about what this meant, and they came up with a proposal that emissions in 1988, which is just off the curve, should come down 25% by the year 2005. That's what that conference proposed. By the time Prime Minister Mulroney went to a big conference in Rio in 1992, where the convention, the United Nations Convention on Climate Change was agreed to, he made a very realistic aspiration. He just said this is what he hoped Canada would be able to do. Just come down roughly 1% a year from 92 out to 2000. By the time Canada went to Kyoto in 1997, our emissions had gone up, and we made a very extravagant commitment. The commitment was that we would reduce our 1990 emissions by 6%. What the Government of Canada probably did not realize was that our emissions in 1997 were already way above that. And so to come back to 1990 and then go down another 6% was an enormous task. We went to Copenhagen, a meeting of the Conference of the Parties in 2009, and we made two commitments actually. We said by 2020, we wanted to be down 15% from where we were. And by that time, the government knew roughly where we were. And we said we also wanted to keep on going down to 30% below where we were by 2030. The government went to the conference in Paris in 2015 and basically reiterated the second target, reduction of 30% of emissions as they were in 2005 by 2030. Let me just show you what we actually did. The thick black line are the emissions that Canada reported to the United Nations. So instead of coming down as the Toronto conference proposed, or as Prime Minister Mulroney proposed, this was a legally binding international agreement. We're already up here and we're trying to come down here. We're not just out of the ballpark, we're in the next county. We have one significant drop here. That's 2008, 2009. It's the consequence of the financial shocks, the New York shocks of 2007 that really crimped the gross domestic product of Canada and most other countries. What happened was a fairly rapid return to growth. No, it didn't get back to where we had been back here, but pretty much there. I made this graph about a year and a half ago. So I didn't have the numbers for 2017, and I only got the number for 2018 about a month ago. We didn't follow this track down. We went up a bit, and then we went up a little bit more. We won't know what we did in 2019 until about a year from now. But we do know that we have a COVID economy at the moment, which is going to drop substantially, and emissions are closely related to gross domestic product, industrial activity, and human activity in general. Let's say they come down by 10% before, and what's going to happen then? They're definitely going to come down. We just don't know how much it's going to be yet, and we won't know for a while. Are they going to go up on a track like that? Are they just going to stick where they are? Or are they going to follow the commitment down to 2030? By the way, I'm going to introduce you to some results from a study done for the Canadian Club of Rome by What If Technologies, using a simulation model, a big simulation model, to say, where are we going to go with the plans that governments and corporations have announced? And it's a very modest decline. So if I just go back one slide a moment, it doesn't matter which government was in power, red or blue, we have basically failed. So these governments, when they made these commitments, were they simply optimists who simply did not understand what they were getting into? Or were they hypocrites with no intention of meeting commitments? Let me just give you a glimpse. This is from a meeting of the Canadian Ministers of the Environment in St. John in June of 1994. This is a sentence out of the statement from that council. The Council of Ministers reaffirmed its commitment to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2000 and to develop sustainable options to achieve further progress in the reduction by 2005. So it wasn't Justin Trudeau who invented sunny ways. It would already been going on for a long time, and maybe much, much longer than that. Now, I've met all kinds of politicians during my life. So, a few are absolute rascals, but almost all of those that I've met have had their hearts in the right place. So I vote that this kind of optimism is simply naive. If you look at what happened, the year that the ministers made that statement, Canada's emissions were 635 megatons. By 2000, when they said they would be stabilized, they'd gone up 15%. That's 2.5% going up the wrong way. In the years subsequently, we've more or less stuck at that level. Here's, I love quotations. Here's one from the Belgian delegate to the Congress of Vienna, which was a big diplomatic clam bake following the demise of Napoleon, which was to set European politics, going the wrong way, and in fact did, but it was extremely slow. And he said, "Le Congrès ne marche pas, il danse." And I take from that Canada has been round dancing on global warming ever since it got interested in this matter in 1988. Now, those delegates who went to Vienna in 1884, they didn't take a train. The first passenger train in the world operated 10 years later, 1825. And it was between Stockton and Darlington in northeastern England, where the folks have a delicious accent, by the way. So the first lesson I draw from what I've presented is that for 3 decades, Canada has not delivered on its aspirations or its commitments. This is a total failure of policy and programs. And it's a failure because that policy and programs were informed only by short-term political thinking and economic analysis. If I go back to the previous slide, this is essentially the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution really began when James Watt invented the first efficient steam engine to pump water out of mines in Cornwall, England, and that was in 1776. It took them 45 years to get to the first passenger train. So global warming has derived from the Industrial Revolution, and it's taken 2 centuries to get where we are today. So we can't possibly deal with it without looking at the long term. Economic analysis is not appropriate on its own because economics typically looks out 2 or 5 years. And how often have you seen an economic forecast that was wrong? So we need a better tool. Canada's options can only be understood in the context of vastly different provincial circumstances. Provinces with coal-fired electricity, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Ontario used to have, Saskatchewan and Alberta, it's relatively easy to reduce those. Ontario closed its 2 big coal-fired stations a decade ago, not because it was concerned about global warming, but because it was convinced that the smog that came from those coal-fired power stations was responsible for something like 4,000 excess deaths every summer smog season. Nova Scotia and New Brunswick have already done some of it. Now, if you look at the hydro provinces, BC, Manitoba, Quebec, and I'll throw Ontario in there as well because it has 60% nuclear and 30% hydro roughly. They have no coal-fired power stations to close. Ontario has already done its easy option, so it can't go any further down that road. And then you think about Alberta and BC, whose economies and whose politics is driven to produce and export natural gas and oil. I'm going to give you just a glimpse of the divergence of the provincial scenes by showing you some graphs from a study done for the Canadian Club of Rome using an energy system simulation tool. This is a huge computer model. It looks at the requirements for energy, the production of energy, and how they get joined together with energy currencies. Energy currencies are electricity, hydrogen, natural gas, and so on. Let's go on to start on the East Coast. Here's New Brunswick. I think you can see pretty clearly that in 2000, roughly half of the emissions in New Brunswick came from burning coal and oil to make electricity. Transportation was about a quarter, everything else was the other quarter. New Brunswick made a strategic decision, NB Power and the provincial government, which owns NB Power, about 10 years ago, that it would close 2 power stations, one fired with coal, one fired with oil. That was the decision to do that was more than just reducing emissions, but reducing emissions was part of their rationale. And so you can see that by the time we get out to 2017, incidentally, I should have mentioned, I'm calling this a reference case because till 2017 is history. These are actually numbers that are reported. Beyond 2017 coming out here, we're looking at a simulation using the plans of governments and corporations that were known to our analyst. New Brunswick, along with the other coal-fired generating provinces, made a commitment in 2017 to turn off their coal-fired power stations by 2030. So if New Brunswick follows through on that, by the time we get to 2030, when it's supposed to be down to 14 megatons, it's actually going to be down to half of that. Let's go to the other coast. In 2000, transportation accounted for the largest part of the emissions in British Columbia. That's road transportation. It does not include aircraft or rail. You probably many people are not aware that BC actually produces quite a lot of natural gas, a little tiny bit of oil. The analysis put those two together for this study, but in case of BC, it's mainly natural gas. And there's something else with natural gas. Natural gas is methane, CH4, molecular weight 12 for carbon, plus 4 hydrogen atoms, 16. It's a very light molecule. Only hydrogen and helium are lighter. So it moves very rapidly and it goes through small holes. So whenever you drill a gas well, some methane escapes. And when it goes through a pumping station, some methane escapes into the atmosphere and leaks along the way. And methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas, 20 times as powerful as carbon dioxide. So what I'm calling fugitive are those losses of methane at the gas wells and in transportation. So production and fugitive together are actually more than the transportation. So let's go to Alberta. I could show you graphs where we asked the analysts to show us what would happen if a province electrified its transport in an aggressive way and did all kinds of other things, but we don't have time for that today. Alberta, of course, the big number is oil and gas, but look, from 2000 coming out here and beyond, it's growing substantially because some of this is gas. There's also a significant emission of methane as a fugitive gas. Alberta is committed to closing its coal-fired power stations by 2030, but that agreement did not include electricity generated from natural gas. This is a tough story. And even if you go in and say, okay, let's begin to close down the oil sands, you still can't get Alberta to its target. You can get it close, but I think we all know politically that isn't going to happen unless COVID really knocks the stuffing out of the oil sands business or the war, the price war between Russia. So this is really tough. But Canada has made international commitments as a country, an entire country. The situations of the provinces varies a lot. So do their opportunities and costs. One size does not fit all. It makes no practical sense. Canada has made international commitments as a country, a single country. But the situations of the provinces vary substantially. And so, of course, do their opportunities and their costs. One size fits all, everybody reduced by 30%, makes no practical sense to me. And that's exacerbated by the preoccupation of government with a carbon tax, which is bound to be ineffective at the prices they're politically able to charge. The carbon tax in my book is an impediment. But I'd like to tell you that technically feasible policy paths do exist to approach the Paris target, but not by 2030. Let's go to lesson 3. My grandfather, my maternal grandfather, was a cabinet maker. He insisted absolutely on the right tool for whatever job he was doing. And I'm pleased to report that some municipal governments in Canada have started to use energy systems modeling to reach their policy and program decisions, including using the Canadian Energy Simulator, which produced the graphs I showed you earlier. So my question is, what on earth can we, with this knowledge, do to enable federal and provincial governments to do likewise, to understand that economics is not enough to set sound policy? Sorry, went one. So now I have 3 questions for you. Based on what you know, what we know, by what year could Canada realistically hit the Paris target of -30 below 2050? And I'll take you back to the bare bones of the slide I showed you earlier, what we actually have emitted, where we say we're going, assuming we're going to come down somewhere here, whether it's there or there, doesn't really matter what happens after. But I think it's really most unlikely that we'll be able to get there by 2030. So when could we get there? And what would it take to do that? Now, the Mowat Centre at the University of Toronto has pointed out, understands equally as well as we do, that the provinces are different. And the way they expressed it was that the allocation of emission reduction burdens will necessarily be asymmetric. And the big issue there is a big federal provincial issue, how to secure equity between jurisdictions. Now, here's a sort of broad philosophical observation. The United Nations reported that emissions, the whole globe, in 2019 were 30 gigatons, heading apparently towards 40. But we know from the climate science, which is solid, that if we want to limit the heating of the world to 2 degrees Celsius, there are some who think it can be limited to 1.5, but that's just starry-eyed in my book, to 20 tons, 20 gigatons. We have one planet with one atmosphere and 8 billion people, roughly. So how about allocating 2.5 tons to everybody in the world, and then letting the markets look after how we do that? A club like the Canadian Club of Rome or the Canadian Meteorological Society can have a certain amount of effect. If they're going to do one thing, what would I have them do? I take a quotation from Frank Luntz, who was the communications guru for George W. Bush, wrote the best book on communications I've ever read. And he said, for anyone aiming to persuade, education must precede motivation and even information. So my approach is education first, because effective persuasion and advocacy depend on it. In fact, advocacy may have to lead with education. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll look forward to hearing from you. Bye.